Welcome back to Readathon. Story Digest Magazine, Dark Shadows. The Interrupted Voyage, Part 3. Calandra rose and walked to the heavy iron door which sealed the tomb from the outside. "Go, Michael," she said, pointing to the massive door. "Go and take from him something which is his and his alone. From what you return to me that is his, will I gather what I will need to crush him." She sprinkled the fragments of glass to the earth floor of the tomb, where they briefly sparkled in the red light of the candle, and then vanished into the ground. Michael rose from his place and walked stiffly to the door. His young frame seemed ponderous, and his step was heavy. His movements were coarse and uneven. He walked like a zombie. "Go, Michael, and do not return until you have what I order." The huge iron door creaked slowly open as Michael pushed against it. A dim moon lighted the odd gravestones of the unholy cemetery. Michael stepped into the night and disappeared in the darkness. Chapter 15. Into the Dark Night. In the shadows of the small sitting room in the widow Starbuck's house, two dark figures quietly whispered. Barnabas and Annabella, safely hidden in the only place the townsmen feared, hurriedly discussed the terrible plight which was theirs. "You must remain here," Barnabas said to Annabella. "You will be safe, for they fear this place because of the woman who lived here." "But what about you?" Annabella asked. "You cannot leave. It is you they are after." She held Barnabas's arms as he began to rise from where he sat. "We must be grateful that you are not suspected," said Barnabas. "Each time they have come upon me, I have been alone. They do not know you are with me." "Then I shall tell them," said Annabella. She was defiant. "I am not afraid." Barnabas looked into his cousin's young face. "You must not act so hastily," he said with a smile. Then changing his tone to great seriousness, he added, "I will need you when the time comes. Until then, you must not do anything to arouse suspicion. You must stay here." Without saying more, he got up and walked to the door. Quietly, he opened it a crack and looked into the dark street outside. "Good," he said. "There is no one about." He turned to Annabella. "Remember what I have said. You must stay here. Open the door to no one. I will need you." Annabella ran to him. "Please be careful," she whispered. I would as much choose to lose you, dear Barnabas, as my own life." She looked past him to the street. "Where do you go now?" she asked, "and when will you return?" He opened the door. "There's but one place where spiritless daughters of the underworld can remain safely out of view of mortals." He pressed her hand. "In the unhallowed ground where the bodies of their victims lie." He turned and disappeared into the night. Chapter 16. A Shred of Recognition. Unseen, a lurking figure hid in the shadows of the street only yards away from where Annabella had quickly closed the door behind the departing Barnabas. It was Michael, on the evil task set by Calandra. Annabella locked the door tightly and retreated into the depths of the room. "He must be careful," she said to herself. "If anything happens, all will be lost." In the distance, a tolling bell struck the hour of midnight. A shiver ran through Annabella as the deathly knells sounded through the quiet house. A sudden pounding drowned the last note of the bell. "Someone has come," Annabella whispered to herself. She froze, not daring to move a muscle. The pounding continued. "They have come to take Barnabas," she thought. Suddenly she relaxed. A soft smile came over her lips. "How foolish," she said aloud. "No one would dare come here." She began to move toward the door. "Townsmen fear this house now more than ever. It must be Barnabas," she said, reaching for the handle. "Perhaps he has forgotten to tell me something, or perhaps he already has news of Michael." She turned the handle. A terrified scream rushed from her throat. Standing in the door, as black as the shadows from which he stepped, was the looming figure of a man. Annabella quickly threw back the door, but the creature which stood before her smashed it open again with a single heavy blow. Annabella stood in the center of the room, speechless, unable to cry out, the fear of imminent death coursing through her chilled veins. The figure stepped into the room. The door slammed behind him. In the darkness, he could hear Annabella's heavy breathing. He stood for a moment listening. Only the sound of Annabella's frightened breath filled the room. He stepped toward her. "Hee!" Annabella screamed as he grabbed her arm and tightened like a vice around it. She struck out at the creature which held her, but he did not loosen his grip. Annabella kicked and struggled, lashing out at the unspeaking beast. Her nails sunk deeply into the flesh of his cheeks. She bit sharply into the soft skin of his neck. Still his grip remained firm. She was unable to free herself. The zombie-like creature pulled Annabella toward the door. Her strength was gone. She quit her struggle. She dropped to the floor, her arm still in the animal-like grip of the dark creature. He dragged her toward the door. He fumbled for a moment with the handle and then pulled. The door creaked open. A thin shaft of moonlight glowed softly on the two figures in the doorway. Annabella looked up into the face of the thing which pulled her toward the street. "Michael!" she screamed, as if suddenly struck by a bolt of lightning. Michael turned his head down to the frail girl he dragged behind him. His eyes, dulled by the unholy curse, stared at a face whose memory flickered dimly in the deepest recesses of his numbed mind. He looked into Annabella's eyes. Something in her frightened stare caused him to loose his grip. She fell to the ground. He looked down at her, and a brief spark of recognition flashed through his vacant mind. "Annabella," he said in a voice which sounded hollow and dead. "Annabella." He lifted his head and looked vaguely into the darkness. His mouth hung open and his eyes were blank. "Annabella," he muttered again. Then he walked away. Chapter 17. Barnabas Falls. Many quick shadows moved rapidly from behind the fallen and tilted stones of the unhallowed resting place of the earlier witches of Salem. Voices whispered feverishly, and dim lanterns cast long, eerie shadows across the grassless place. "Shh!" hissed a voice from near a stone crypt in the deepest portion of the cemetery. "If he hears us or sees our lights, he will flee." It was the bearded leader of the mob. The others were hiding all around. "Why can't we find him?" A man holding a sharp-tined pitchfork asked the man next to him. "If this is where the black spirits of the devil lurk, where is the dark stranger we seek?" "I don't know," answered another, a heavy club clenched tightly in his hand. "But when he does come," he said, cutting a swath through the air with his weapon, "I will be ready for him." "And I," piped in another, who held a blackened torch in the air, ready to ignite the oil-soaked staff. "I am ready when he comes." "Shh," hissed the leader. "There he is." In the darkness at the edge of the cemetery, a black-caped man walked stealthily toward the group of waiting men, unaware of their presence. It was Barnabas. "Get him!" shouted the leader as he leaped from behind his hiding place. Immediately many sparks flashed and ignited fires on the ends of countless torches. Long, oily flames leaped into the air, filling the graveyard with furiously dancing shadows. Barnabas whirled at the sound, but it was too late. Dozens of men poured out from behind craggy trees and overturned gravestones, waving heavy clubs and brandishing deathly sharp pitchforks. He lifted his cane and slashed the air to defend himself, but he was overwhelmed. Stop, he cried out. "I am innocent. The one you seek is in this very place." Before he could say any more, the heavy blow of a club struck him on the side of the head, and he fell to the ground unconscious. "Is he dead?" shouted the man who had struck him down. "No, but it would be just as well," cried another. "It would save us the trouble of destroying him ourselves." "Kill him now!" shouted a man holding a torch near Barnabas's glazed, unseeing eyes. Why wait for the black powers which sent him to come and level more terror upon us? The leader tore the torch from the man's hand. "No," he shouted, "there will be no murder in Salem." He looked down at Barnabas's battered head. "Not even if the victim is the son of the devil himself." He stood back to make way for two strong men who lifted Barnabas from the ground. "He will go to jail and be tried for witchcraft," the man shouted. "Then," he added, a tone of gloom thundering from his throat, "then he will die at the stake." A hush fell over the mob as they carried Barnabas down the dreary hill toward Salem. Chapter 19. The Incantation. As the last flickering torches of the mob disappeared over the hill, Michael walked heavily over the lifeless earth of the graveyard. His footsteps led him back into the oldest part of the cemetery, back toward a crumbling, cold crypt. A cloud parted briefly, letting a glimmer of dim moonlight through. Something glittered on the ground near Michael's plodding feet. He stopped and searched the darkening shadows. "Take something which is his," a far-off voice in his mind echoed. "Do not return until you have what I ordered," it said. Michael looked over the hard-packed earth. He dropped to his knees and groped along the ground for whatever it had been that shone in the pale moonlight. His hand struck something cold. He closed his grip around it and dragged it from where it had fallen. It was Barnabas's walking stick, its silver head grimed by the evil dust of the place. Michael smiled dully through his open mouth. The brief hope of Annabella's vision on his mind disappeared. He rose heavily to his feet and walked toward the crypt, the cane clenched tightly in his fist. Calandra screeched as Michael pushed open the heavy door and entered her dimly lit cave. "You have it!" she cackled. "Give it to me!" She raced to him and grabbed the stick from Michael's hand. "Go!" she shouted at him, her evil lips barking at her mindless servant. "Sit in that corner until I need you." Turning from him, she held the cane high above her head. "Now I will find out who you are," she said, talking to the stick itself, "and I will discover how to destroy you." She laid the cane atop a dust-covered casket which sat on 2 stone supports in the middle of the room. With a glinting sharp nail of her forefinger, she traced a circle in the dust around the cane. At the head end, she drew the sign of death, and at the tip end, she traced the sign of life. With a practiced hand, she filled the circle with other curious marks and strange symbols. "Bring me the candle," she called to Michael as she worked, not looking up from the circle of signs in front of her. Michael walked slowly to the black, shafted candle and carried it to her. "Now go," she said. "Go to the crypt below this. No one must witness the powers from below which I can call forth." She pointed off, and Michael humbly obeyed, unable to resist. Calandra lifted the candle from its iron holder. The blood-red flame glimmered brightly. She held the candle in the center and touched a fingertip to the unlit end. Immediately, it too burst into flame, a brilliant white fire which poured forth gray clouds of smoke. "Son of darkness, father of night, arise from your pit and give me light," she incanted over the walking stick as she dripped wax from both ends of the candle into the circle of dust. As if lighted from the very core of the earth, the evil chamber began to glow. Its stone walls turned crimson, and the floor smoked with white heat. The walking stick began to smolder. In a flash, it ignited and was instantly burned to a crisp. Pale blue smoke arose from the fire which consumed it. Calandra stared into the smoke. She smiled as ghostly shapes began to move within the curtain of mist above the casket. "Make yourself known to me," she said in a voice which crackled like the fires of below. "Tell me your story." As she spoke, the figures in the smoke became clear. One was Barnabas. Chapter 20. Sisters of Darkness. In the haze of history which rose from the burnt walking stick, Barnabas began to speak. You have killed her," he shouted to an unseen figure in the misty background. "You have killed her as if by your own hands you had lighted the fire which consumed her at the stake." He raised his black cape over his head and plunged into the darkness of that vision. "For that I shall kill you, Reverend Trask," he screamed. The vision faded. Calandra watched on. Soon another scene emerged from the smoke. Hanging by his wrists from black iron chains was a man of the cloth. His face was etched with terror. His voice parched and dry. "No, Barnabas," he pleaded, "do not do this thing to me. I beg you, do not do this." Barnabas stepped from the gloom, holding a brick and trowel. There was a whole pile of bricks behind him. With the unskilled hand of a novice, he began to build a wall to seal the Reverend Mr. Trask forever in the chill cellar. "Your pleas do not dissuade me, Reverend Trask," Barnabas said. "I will avenge the death you have caused." He placed another brick on the growing wall. Soon the man's cries from behind were muffled and lost. The wall was completed. Reverend Trask was left to die. Calandra laughed a fiendish laugh. "Such a strange one you are," she said to the vision of Barnabas, who stood in the mist above the casket, a trowel still clutched in his hand. "How very interesting you are." Her face clouded. "But how can it be that one who has done such a deed as I have just witnessed can come now to this time in this place, and to seek me and perhaps destroy me?" Again the mist of the vision flowed, and yet another scene revealed the truth of Barnabas's early life. Angelique, mysterious, yet as beautiful as a goddess, stood before Barnabas, whose knees quaked at her sight. "You have destroyed Reverend Trask," she said in a voice which was smooth and soft, but which had a sinister echo deep within it. "For that, the price you pay will be great." She leaped toward him and clutched him by his shirt front. She bared her teeth. They were pointed and sharp. A grotesque laugh shrieked from her lips. "Now you will pay, Barnabas Collins, forever." Before he could move, she plunged her teeth into his neck, as a cry of terror screamed from his gaping mouth. "The mark of the bat," Calandra wheeled from the vision. "So that's it," she cried. "His name is Barnabas Collins, and he once carried the mark of the bat." She paced the floor rapidly as her evil mind reflected the visions of history she had just seen. "So, Barnabas Collins," she said after a time, "I now know what your great weakness is. I know now how to destroy you." She hurried back to the smoldering dust atop the coffin. "Hear me, sister of fate," she shouted. "Make your presence known to me here, so that together we may finish the one who is hated by both of us." The flames of the candles spat fiery sparks, and great clouds of billowing smoke were emitted from both ends, the solemn dark crypt filled with the smoke of the underworld. "I am come!" In the midst of the curling smoke stood Angelique, an evil smile upon her lips. In the deep gloom of an unhallowed grave, two strangely beautiful creatures of darkness planned the fate of Barnabas Collins. Calandra, sinister and evil, spoke first. "The one you seek is here," she said. "I do not know why he has returned through the shades of time to trouble me, but he is here, and he must be destroyed." As she spoke, her voice shrieked higher and higher until the room seemed to be filled with a million furies. "I know why he is here," answered Angelique. "I visited him only a brief moment ago, as he made his way through the mists of time to this place." She looked into Calandra's dark eyes. "He was near death from drowning, as the ship which transported him sunk beneath the waves. His soul was nearly mine when his wretched will denied me that which rightfully belongs to me. He saved himself from death." Her voice became bitter. "If he dies in this place, his soul will be mine once more." She spit the final words from her mouth. "I must have him!" Michael stirred in the depths of the tomb beneath the two sisters of darkness. Their voices filtered down a dank stairway of stone and fell on his clouded ears. "Then take him," cried Calandra. "Destroy him however you please. His death will bring no suspicion to me, and I will be free to continue the work of him below, who grants us our power of evil." Silence followed as Michael listened. Then the creaking of the iron door broke the stillness. Calandra shouted from above. "Michael, come!" she called. "I have good news. My sister departs to destroy the strange man who seeks us. His death stalks him now." Chapter 21. Angelique Strikes. Annabella ran tearfully through the empty, cobbled streets of Salem. Panicky, she hurried up one street and down another looking for Barnabas. "Please," she sobbed as she ran, "please protect him. I need him so," she cried. "Don't let anything happen to him." The terrible struggle she had fought with Michael, and the awful revelation that it was he gripped her mind. "Oh, Barnabas," she pleaded, "come back, please, please come back." A shadowy figure approached her from the dark distance. Annabella stopped. The tears which clouded her eyes deceived her. "Barnabas?" she called to the shrouded figure. "Is it you?" She lifted her gown and ran quickly toward the form. "Barnabas," she called out, "wait for me." The figure stopped. Slowly it turned as Annabella came abreast. Angelique grinned from beneath the folds of the dark mantle she wore. Annabella stiffened with fright. Her mouth opened, but her throat choked with terror. With a single quick movement of her arm, Angelique reached for the young girl and clasped a hand over her mouth. "I wait," she hissed in Annabella's ear as the girl stared helplessly from under her grasp. "But I am not Barnabas." She looked deeply into Annabella's eyes. "How convenient," she said as the power of darkness, burning in her own eyes, pierced into Annabella's soul. "How convenient to find one whom Barnabas trusts." As she spoke, her body turned instantly to vapor and vanished. Annabella's eyes rolled deep in their sockets, and then just as quickly opened. The fires of the lower depths glowed inside them. "Now, Barnabas," she said, a chilling hiss in her voice, "now you are mine." It was Angelique. She had entered Annabella's body and now controlled her will. She searched the street. The people of Salem remained ignorant of the terrible things which were taking place beneath their very windows. "Now," said Angelique, "I will find Barnabas and destroy him." She lifted the folds of Annabella's dress and hurried toward the town square where flickering torchlight and muttering voices told her she would find what she was looking for. In the square, the mob began to break up. "He is locked tightly in a strong cell," the leader called to the others as he came out of the jail entrance. "He will be safe until the morrow when we can judge him." "And burn him," called a voice from within the crowd. The other men roared approval. "That will come on the morrow," the leader said. "But now return to your homes. You and your families are safe this night." As he finished, the men broke up into small groups and departed. Soon the square was dark, the last torch gone. Annabella's captured body stepped from the shadows. Her eye was on the entrance to the jail, a sturdy building which faced the square. "So my precious Barnabas has been caught and put in a cage like some wild beast," she said aloud, a loathing laugh on her lips. "Perhaps it will be well for me to visit him in his new den." Angelique's sharp teeth flashed white in the dull light of the moon. "He will surely be happy to see me." She ran toward the jail. A light knock at the door roused the jailer from a light slumber. "Who is it?" he called as he reached for a lantern which lighted the narrow passage which led into the depths of the jail. "Who knocks?" he called. There was no answer. The jailer walked toward the front of the jail. He stopped at the closed door and held his lantern high. Through the small window in the heavy door, a woman's face smiled at him. "Who are you and what do you want?" he asked. "I am forbidden to open this door." He waited for a reply. "Please," asked Angelique, hiding behind Annabella's sweet smile, "the prisoner is my dear friend," she called. "Please let me see him." Her voice was plaintive and soft. "Friend or not," answered the jailer, "I have my orders and I cannot open for any man." He paused and looked again into Annabella's eyes. "Nor any woman," he added with a smile. Then your orders be hanged," hissed Angelique as her own death-like stare flickered out from beneath Annabella's eyes. She gazed deep into the jailer's face, transfixing him as he stood by the door. His jaw dropped open, and his eyes glazed over. "Open the door," she hissed. "Now!" In a trance, brought on by the witch's stare, the jailer put his hand heavily on the latch which held the door closed. He lifted it, and the massive door swung open on its great iron hinges. "Now get out of my sight, you fool!" Angelique shouted to the stunned man as she hurried to the back of the jail. The man backed against a wall and slowly drooped to the floor. Angelique scanned the wall by the jailer's desk. On a strong nail hung the keys to the cell doors. Lifting them from their place, she stole quietly into the back of the prison. Barnabas "Barnabas," she called in a voice mimicking Annabella's. "Barnabas," she called again, "where are you?" In his dark cell, Barnabas lifted his sad head from his arms. Had he heard what he thought he heard? He listened. Again the sound. "Annabella?" he whispered. "Is it you?" The key jangled as Angelique unlocked the barred wooden door to Barnabas's cell. Yes, she answered, "it is I." She pushed open the door and stood before him. Barnabas was stunned. "How have you done such a thing?" he began, but his sentence was cut short by Angelique. "Be quiet," she whispered. She acted as if the jailer were just outside the door. "We only have a few moments." She went on as she moved closer to him. Then, as if suddenly overcome with emotion at seeing the man who was risking his very soul to help her, she ran to him, her arms outstretched. "Oh, Barnabas," she cried, her voice choking with mock sorrow. "Dear Barnabas, I was so frightened for you." She threw her arms around him and held him tight. For a moment, Barnabas was overcome by emotion. He put his arms around his cousin, who clutched him tightly. "Do not worry any longer," he said. "Somehow I will make them believe me." Angelique lifted her head from Barnabas's shoulder. She smiled evilly, her terrible teeth glistening sharply in the lantern light. She pulled his cape away from his neck, baring the tender flesh of his throat to her view. Her eyes brightened. "They will believe you," she said, "once they find this." Like a viper striking out at its victim, she opened her mouth wide and leaped at his throat. "Angelique!" Barnabas screamed as he stared at the flashing face which was inches away from his neck. With the strength born of fear, he leaped away from her, at the same time lashing out with a clenched fist. His blow flew far wide of the mark, and Angelique leaped again for his bared throat. "You are mine!" she cried, and she clutched him tightly as he fell back against the wall. A strange light suddenly flashed in her evil eyes from the window above Barnabas's head. She looked up through the heavy iron bars. The first rays of dawn broke through the morning mists, and sunlight streamed into the jail. She let go of Barnabas and raised her arm to protect herself from the light. "No!" she screamed, but the light continued to brighten the room. Barnabas stared in horror. Before his eyes, the figure of Annabella vanished in a cloud of gray mist. In an instant, he was alone. Angelique had been banished from this time. On the cobbled street beyond the town square, another ray of early sun lightened a dim doorway. Annabella lifted her head. Dazed, she rubbed her eyes as if to rub from them some terrible vision of the night. She was unaware of what had happened to her. Chapter 22. Condemned. The town square filled with anxious Salemites. They awaited the hour of the trial of the devil they had captured on unhallowed ground the night before. At the far end of the square, men unloaded stacks of tinder dry wood and heaped them around a straight timber stake high on a platform overlooking the square. A buzz of voices filtered through the crowd, and every head turned toward the jail. The front door opened, and Barnabas, surrounded by heavily armed guards, was dragged in chains across the square. Hundreds of eyes watched as he was led into a white wooden courthouse, where the door slammed closed behind him. "Burn him now!" cried a woman, clutching a small child to her. "Our lives aren't safe while he walks the streets of our town." The crowd roared its approval. "Burn him now! Burn him now!" they chanted. "Burn him now!" Inside the courtroom, the spectators' gallery was filled to overflowing. Barnabas looked around at the hate-filled faces as he was led to the front of the room and seated in a hard wooden chair for all to see. "I must convince them of my innocence," he thought. "If I die here in this time, my soul will be forever lost." His eyes showed the horror of what his mind knew. "I will be doomed forever to life without rest." A judge in a black robe and white curly wig entered the room. The crowd fell silent. He climbed to his place behind a long table in back of Barnabas and pounded his gavel against the sturdy oak. "Let this trial begin," he said. "In the name of all that is righteous and holy, let justice be done." Barnabas began to rise from his place, eager to tell the truth of his terrible predicament. A heavy hand pushed him back to his chair. "There'll be none of that," a man with a pistol in his belt hissed under his breath. "I'll see to that." He patted his gun and looked up at the judge. "This man is accused of being in consort with the devil," the judge began. "Who so accuses?" Countless voices from among the spectators. "I saw him appear in a cloud of smoke," shouted one. "He tried to steal my child," cried another. "His cloven hoof marks are imprinted in the widow Starbuck's door," wailed another. At the sound of the name, which reminded all of another recent strange death, the room became quiet. The judge spoke in a somber tone. Are there any who would defend this creature of the night?" At this statement, the crowd went insane. "Burn him now," they cried. "We are not safe until he dies." The judge pounded his gavel against the desk. Barnabas looked up hopefully. At last, he thought, I can defend myself. But the judge looked down at him with a dark and sinister scowl. "I find you guilty, son of Satan," he intoned in the thundering voice of doom, "and so sentence you to perish at the stake this very day at the hour of 3 o'clock. Barnabas looked to the large pendulum clock which ticked noisily in the back of the room. It was nearly noon. He had a scant 3 hours to live. Chapter 23. Love Cries Out. The crowd gathered on the lawn in the square was strangely silent as they waited for the appointed hour. Barnabas had been returned to his cell and now also waited. What grave injustice have I caused to come to such a fate?" he moaned, the terror of this terrible journey through time crushing down on his shoulders. "I have willingly come to help another," he cried in anguish, "another whose own soul lives the dread of eternal unrest. Is there no justice?" He said softly, quietly resigning himself to his fate. "Is there no justice?" Suddenly his thoughts turned from himself. He gasped. "What of Annabella?" he cried. "She will suffer for no fault of her own." Another thought haunted his awakening mind. "And Michael," he shouted aloud, "is Michael to be doomed too?" He raised himself from the straw-covered floor of his cell. The sun shone brilliantly through the bars over his head. He gazed up into the pure light of the heavens. "Am I so weak to give up before the end comes?" he asked himself aloud. "There is a way," he went on. "I'm not finished yet." Barnabas began to quickly pace the floor of his cell, his hand held firmly to his chin as he plunged his mind into deep thought. "There is a way," he burst out again, heedless of the grumblings of the jailer who listened to the ravings of a madman in his jail. "If Annabella were only here, if somehow she could come to me, if I could reach her wherever she is, if she could come." He closed his eyes tightly and thought of Annabella, whose innocence had suffered for 160